The summer sun glared down like a judgmental god as I steered my old Ford F-250 down a winding, dust-choked road in the high desert. The windshield was chipped from years of freeway pebbles, but that didn't stop me from seeing the view that opened up in front of me. A wide, golden valley framed by distant mountains and streaked with the shadows of clouds that wandered lazily across the endless sky. The heat shimmered off the hood like ripples on a pond, and my palms sweated against the worn leather of the steering wheel. This was the moment, the culmination of nearly 15 years of grinding, saving, sacrificing. I had just risked every dime I owned, $750,000, the entirety of my life savings, on a forgotten, abandoned ranch that hadn't seen a working fence or a living cow in over 2 decades. To most people, it looked like a mistake. The paint on the main house peeled in sun-bleached flakes. The barn sagged as if it had given up trying to stand, and invasive tumbleweeds danced freely across the gravel driveway like they owned the place. But to me, it was a canvas, a beginning. I was done with city life, done with rent, done with offices, fluorescent lights, and neighbors who wouldn't say hello. I wanted earth beneath my nails. I wanted silence, space, the kind of peace that comes from watching your own sunrise with a cup of coffee brewed on a stove powered by solar panels you installed yourself. I stepped out of the truck and was greeted by the sound of dry grass rustling in the wind and the soft creak of metal as the old ranch gate swung slowly behind me. My boots sank slightly into the dusty soil as I walked toward the porch, and every creak of the floorboards felt like the house whispering, "Are you sure?" But I was sure. More sure than I'd been about anything in my life. The air tasted like sage and distant wildfire. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with history, as if the land itself had stories it was waiting to tell me. It was perfect, in that wild, broken, stubborn way that only land like this could be. I had plans: restore the barn, repair the roof, clear out the junk behind the tool shed, maybe even dig a small garden near the east wall. I'd start small. Build smart, off-grid if I could. I had researched water rights, checked the solar exposure, walked the perimeter and counted every fence post that needed replacing. I was ready to work. I was ready to live. What I wasn't ready for, what no inspection, no Google search, no real estate lawyer had warned me about, was the HOA. I didn't even know there was one. The listing had mentioned nothing. The land was zoned rural agricultural, not residential. There were no sidewalks, no shared amenities, no gates or guards. Just me and my dust-covered dream. But a week after I moved in, before I had even finished unpacking my tools or replacing the broken glass in the kitchen window, it began. First came a letter, a polite but condescending envelope bearing the letterhead of something called the Cimarron Bluffs Residential Association. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding that envelope, sweating in the stifling afternoon heat, and reading the words as if they were written in a foreign language. "Dear property owner," it began, "it has come to our attention that a new resident has taken occupancy of parcel #73A, which is located within the governance boundary of the Cimarron Bluffs HOA. According to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, all landowners within the jurisdictional perimeter are required to formally apply for HOA membership and comply with aesthetic, noise, environmental, and usage guidelines as outlined in the 2020 HOA Charter, Article 4. I blinked. What the hell was this? I didn't buy into any community. There was no clubhouse, no pool, no trash pickup service. I was miles from the nearest paved road. My land sat on a separate plat, not even touching the subdivision they'd mentioned. So how the hell could they say I was under them? The last line chilled me. Failure to comply may result in fines, liens, and legal proceedings. I folded the letter carefully, put it down on the counter next to my hammer and rolled up blueprints, and walked outside into the sun. I looked at the land, at the barn, at the half-dug trench for the gray water line I was installing. I listened to the wind whistling through the fence posts and thought, no, not a chance in hell. That was the moment the dream cracked, just slightly. The moment the battle began. I didn't move out to the desert to make enemies. If anything, I thought I was escaping conflict, trading in the short tempers and parking disputes of the city for wind, space, and the occasional coyote. My name's Daniel Hart. I'm 43, a former software consultant turned reluctant homesteader. After 2 decades of grinding in a high-stress job I barely tolerated, I cashed out, sold my downtown condo, and poured everything into this land. I didn't do it on a whim. I had plans, budgets, timelines. I had a dream that involved chickens, solar panels, hand-dug irrigation trenches, and eventually maybe a rescue dog. Not a clipboard-wielding homeowner named Karen Mitchell who believed she had jurisdiction over my dreams. Karen was the president of the Cimarron Bluffs Homeowners Association, a woman who smelled like lavender and litigation. I met her 3 days after I received the first letter. She didn't call, didn't email. She showed up at the edge of my property line in a spotless white SUV, oversized sunglasses shading eyes that had clearly never missed a line in a contract. She parked like she owned the place, stepped out in designer hiking boots that had probably never touched real dirt, and announced her name like it carried legal weight. "I'm Karen Mitchell, representing Cimarron Bluffs," she said, hand extended like a sheriff come to lay down the law. "I assume you've received our welcome letter?" "Yeah," I said, not shaking her hand. "I read it." She smiled tightly. "Good. Then you understand the process." What I understood in that moment was that I was dealing with a professional meddler. Someone who probably organized community potlucks and reported minor mailbox graffiti with the same sense of urgency most people reserved for house fires. She wasn't just a stickler. She was the kind of person who printed out emails and filed them in color-coded folders. Behind her, in the passenger seat of the SUV, was a man who didn't get out. I later learned his name was Greg Harrison, HOA vice president and retired accountant. He handled most of the compliance documentation, which I would come to know meant passive-aggressive notices and threatening legalese. Greg wore sweater vests in the middle of summer and drove around with a portable printer. I wish I were exaggerating. They were the face of the HOA, not elected by the people, but carried forward like a plague from previous boards. Most of the other residents, wealthy retirees, vacation homeowners, or remote workers who barely spent time on site, either didn't care or were too apathetic to push back. Karen and Greg ruled the neighborhood with newsletters, fines, and a constant stream of policy updates no one read. They loved being in control. They lived for it. But here's the thing. I never asked to be part of their world. My land sat at the far edge of the county records, inherited from a historic cattle parcel that had been subdivided decades ago. It was an oddity, a legal gray zone left behind when the developers of Cimarron Bluffs bought up the rest of the valley and paved over its history. My deed was clear. My zoning status was agricultural. But somehow, deep in the dense, footnote-littered bylaws of the HOA charter, someone had drawn a line that, according to Karen, wrapped around my parcel like a noose. "This land is under our jurisdiction," she said, tapping a laminated map she had pulled from her SUV like it was a holy text. "You'll need to submit renovation plans and bring your exterior structures into visual compliance." I stared at her, stunned. "You want me to paint my barn beige?" Karen didn't flinch. "Cimarron tan. It's in the guidelines." That was the moment I realized what I was up against. This wasn't just a paperwork misunderstanding. It wasn't about protecting property values or keeping the community aesthetically cohesive. This was about control, about people who'd grown used to telling others what to do and getting away with it. My neighbors, few and far between, were a mixed bag. There was Tony, an ex-military contractor who lived 3 plots over in a converted shipping container, and didn't much like the HOA either. He flew a tattered American flag over his generator shed and once told me over a beer, "Karen came by once. I just revved my dirt bike till she left." Then there was Marcy, a retired botanist who kept to herself and spent her days cultivating desert succulents. She said the HOA had no teeth, but advised me to document everything. So I did. I kept the letters, the photos, the time-stamped videos of drive-by inspections. I made a folder titled "In Case of Court," because as absurd as it seemed, it was becoming very clear that this wasn't going to just go away. This wasn't a mistake I could clear up with a phone call. This was a fight. And it wasn't just about a barn or a color or a patch of scrubland in the desert. It was about whether freedom still meant anything when someone in a collared shirt and a board title could walk onto your land and tell you how to live. It started with a second letter, thicker this time. I found it wedged in my fence, weighted down with a rock like some kind of frontier-era summons. The paper was crisp and corporate, printed in blue ink with a watermark that screamed self-importance. Notice of non-compliance. It read in bold at the top. Subject: unauthorized structures, unapproved modifications, and visible storage. My heart sank as I scanned the rest. They had listed infractions like they were building a case against a criminal. 1. Unpainted barn in visible disrepair. 2. Portable storage units placed without visual screening. And my personal favorite, unauthorized trench excavation without soil impact assessment. I sat down on the tailgate of my truck, the paper rattling in the wind, and just stared out over my land, trying to process what I was reading. I'd been here less than 2 weeks. I hadn't even finished clearing out the inside of the barn. And already they were treating me like some rogue developer with a backhoe and a grudge. That night, I barely slept. I kept going over every detail in my head. Every nail I'd hammered, every tarp I'd laid, every bag of cement I'd bought. Was I really breaking rules? Or were they just inventing them? I reread the county records, combed through my deed, even pulled up satellite images of the property lines just to make sure I hadn't missed something. I hadn't. I was on my own land, outside the paved roads, outside the neighborhood gates, outside of their manufactured little world. But the HOA didn't see it that way. 2 days later, I woke up to find a stake driven into the edge of my driveway. Attached to it was a laminated sheet, a bright red warning notice. Final reminder. Application for HOA membership required. Deadline, 15 days. I remember standing there, barefoot in the morning light, staring at that stake like it was a spear aimed at my future. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was warfare by paperwork. And I was starting to realize they didn't need to be right. They just needed to be relentless. I made some calls that morning. First to the county assessor's office, who confirmed my parcel was zoned agricultural residential, and that HOA covenants were voluntary in most cases. Most. That word hung in my mind like a trapdoor. Then I called the title company who had handled my purchase. The woman on the line pulled up my file and said, "You're not listed as part of any HOA, sir." That gave me a surge of hope. For about 10 minutes. Until Karen called. Yes, called. Apparently, she'd found my number from public real estate filings. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Daniel, I wanted to give you a courtesy heads up that we'll be conducting a compliance inspection this week. Tuesday, probably around 10 a.m. Just to ensure your site isn't causing any issues for the broader community." The broader community? I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "I'm half a mile from your nearest house." "Well," she said sweetly, "we have to think about the visual impact on the entryway corridor." Entryway corridor? What was this, Disneyland? "Karen," I said, "you do realize you don't actually have legal jurisdiction over my land, right?" A pause. Just long enough to let me know she didn't appreciate being challenged. "That's a matter we're willing to clarify in court if necessary," she said, before hanging up. I stood there, phone in hand, stunned. I'd been through difficult clients, angry project managers, even a small IRS audit once. But this was something else. This wasn't logic. This was cult-level bureaucracy. It didn't matter that I wasn't in their subdivision. They had decided I belonged under their thumb, and they weren't going to stop until I either bowed or bled money fighting it. The next morning, I saw Greg's SUV parked at the end of my road, just sitting there. No one got out, just watching. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If this was how they wanted to play it, I'd play. I was stubborn by birth, raised by a father who once drove 120 miles just to return a hammer that cost $4.99 and didn't work as advertised. I wasn't going to roll over, but I was also realizing that this wouldn't be a short fight. This was the moment when the lines were drawn. The dream I had of peaceful mornings, hard work, and honest sweat was now wrapped in red tape and HOA doublespeak. I come here to build something real. They were determined to destroy it with clipboards and clauses. I had no choice now. I had to fight. The following week, the HOA turned up the pressure like a slow, relentless vice. It started with the inspections, quiet, unofficial, and always unannounced. I'd hear tires crunching gravel mid-morning and look up from the trench I was digging to see Karen's white SUV nosing down the road again. She never came onto the property, not physically. She didn't have to. Instead, she'd park just close enough to aim her phone at my barn, take a few pictures, then drive off like she was documenting a crime scene. It became a routine once or twice a week, every week. Sometimes Greg would come instead, his blue Prius awkwardly out of place in the desert. I started wondering if they were cataloging my every move, compiling a dossier to bury me in bureaucracy. The letters multiplied. They stopped being vague and started being specific. Violation number 3. Use of unapproved building materials. Violation number 4. Failure to submit fencing plans. Violation number 5. Unauthorized livestock containment. Livestock? I didn't even have animals yet. I had a shovel, a rake, and a stack of cedar boards I hadn't even touched. But that didn't stop them. Every time I opened my mailbox, I half expected to find a fine for unauthorized sunrise viewing or non-compliant wheelbarrow orientation. It would have been funny if it wasn't so maddening. Then came the fines. Real ones. Certified mail this time, each envelope with an invoice-style sheet attached. $250 for non-compliance. $150 for failure to submit landscaping plan. $600 for visual nuisance. The amounts were arbitrary, the tone increasingly aggressive. They referenced articles from the HOA charter I'd never seen before, and when I asked for a copy, I was told to request it through a formal petition, accompanied by a $45 processing fee. At night, I started locking my tools in the shed. Not because I was worried about theft, but because I didn't trust what they might accuse me of next. Abandoned equipment? Community hazard? I wouldn't put it past them. I began photographing everything I did. Each board I nailed, each tarp I unfolded, each bag of gravel I unloaded. I documented it all. I wasn't just building a ranch anymore. I was building a legal defense. I tried reasoning with them. God help me, I tried. I wrote a letter, calm, civil, filled with legal citations and county codes. I explained that I wasn't part of the HOA, that my deed made no mention of their jurisdiction, and that their fines were unenforceable. I emailed it, mailed it, and even dropped off a copy in their community office. An air-conditioned modular building decorated with inspirational quotes and passive-aggressive signage about recycling bins. A week later, I got a reply, not from Karen, from the HOA's legal liaison, a man named Elliot Rains, who signed his letter with ESQ and wrote like a man who had been waiting his whole life to weaponize a thesaurus. The gist of it was this: while your deed may not explicitly mention the HOA, due to the expanded perimeter outlined in the 2017 Boundary Revision Agreement, your parcel is considered part of the Cimarron Bluffs Extended Visual and Regulatory Zone. Compliance is not optional. Extended Visual and Regulatory Zone? I laughed, out loud, in the middle of my empty field. It was the kind of legal fiction that made you question reality. They were claiming the right to govern based on how visible my house was from their entrance sign. That was like saying you owned the moon because you could see it from your backyard. Still, the pressure worked. Not in the way they wanted. It didn't make me surrender. But it changed me. The joy I'd felt in those first days began to sour. I started waking up with my jaw clenched. I stopped working until after lunch, just in case one of them drove by in the morning. I even paused construction on the barn, afraid they'd claim I was building without a permit. Even though, legally, I didn't need one under rural zoning laws. I began to dread the mailbox. I began to hate the silence that had once felt like peace. Even my neighbors noticed. Tony dropped by one afternoon with a six-pack of warm beer and a quiet nod. "They're pushing hard, huh?" he said, sitting on an overturned bucket. "They tried that crap with me 3 years ago. Said my solar panels were reflectively offensive." I chuckled. "What did you do?" "Painted them camo. Didn't change a thing. But it pissed Karen off." We laughed, but underneath the humor was frustration. Shared, worn, and old. I wasn't the first, but I was starting to wonder if I'd be the last. That night, after sorting through 3 more letters, including one threatening a lien, I sat on my porch and stared out at the desert. The stars were sharp and cold, the kind of sky you can only get far from city lights. This was supposed to be freedom, but I felt trapped in someone else's nightmare. A prison without bars, enforced by busybodies and bylaws. I realized something then. This wasn't going to stop. Not until I gave in, or fought back. It happened while I was down in the trench behind the barn, covered in sweat and soil, trying to dig out a water line I'd mapped from an old survey. My hands were blistered. My shirt was stuck to my back. I hadn't gotten mail in 2 days, not because the HOA had let up, but because I had stopped checking. I needed a break, a breath, a moment of peace. Then my shovel hit something. Not rock, not pipe, wood, hollow. I dropped to my knees and scraped the dirt away with my hands until the outline came into view. A box. Rough-cut pine, water-damaged but intact. I wrestled it out of the trench and pried it open. Inside were 2 leather-bound ledgers, a rusted key, and a stack of curled, yellowing documents. They smelled like history and mildew. I took them inside, dusted them off, and started flipping through them. Turns out, the previous owner of this land, Robert O. Calhoun, was not only the man who built the barn I was restoring, but the last holdout from the original cattle cooperative that had once occupied the valley before the HOA had ever existed. And inside those ledgers were detailed notes, grievances, water rights, zoning disputes, and, most importantly, signed correspondence from county officials stating that the Calhoun parcel, my parcel, had explicitly been excluded from the Cimarron development boundaries due to an unresolved easement dispute from 1989. A legal oversight, buried and forgotten, but still enforceable. I read it twice, then 3 times. Then I started digging deeper. I scanned the documents, cross-referenced property maps, and pulled up archived county planning minutes from over 2 decades ago. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. The HOA had expanded aggressively in the early 2000s, purchasing nearby lots and redrawing their community plan. But they had never officially amended the master plan to include Calhoun's property. Their extended visual zone? Pure fiction. I wasn't just outside their control, I was a legal thorn in their side. An unclaimed pocket of freedom they had simply hoped no one would notice. And I had proof. That night, I poured a whiskey, sat under the stars, and let the realization settle. I'd been defending myself for weeks, reacting to every letter, every visit, every ridiculous accusation. But now I had leverage. I had a legacy, and I had an idea. The next morning, I started quietly gathering intel. I created a burner email, signed up for HOA newsletters under a fake name, and joined their community Facebook group. I didn't post, just watched, observed, learned. Karen was extremely active, sharing long-winded posts about neighborhood cohesion and architectural purity, complete with photos of minor violations like overgrown shrubs or slightly discolored garage doors. I also started talking to the neighbors more. Tony, of course, had war stories of his own. Marcy shared old photos she'd taken from before the HOA paved the streets, showing the original layout of the valley, including my land clearly outside the initial boundaries. Even old Bill, from 3 plots over, told me he remembered when Karen just moved here and started ordering people around like she owned a badge. But the best part? I discovered that multiple other properties had quietly opted out of the HOA years ago, and the HOA had no legal power to enforce dues or regulations against them. They just never advertised it. Most people didn't realize you could say no. That became the heart of my strategy. Expose the illusion. I drafted a report, detailed, sourced, polite but firm. I attached maps, quotes from county officials, copies of the Calhoun documents, and legal language showing how the HOA's authority had no reach over my land. Then I dropped a copy off at their office. But I didn't stop there. I printed 12 more copies and slipped them into mailboxes across the community. Just the properties on the fringe, the ones most likely to be in the same legal limbo as me. I left no note, just the facts. Let the words speak for themselves. I also filed a formal request with the county zoning board to have my property publicly reaffirmed as non-HOA jurisdiction. a request that, if approved, would be added to the public record and searchable in their online parcel database. But the final touch was poetic. Using a projector and a white sheet pinned to the side of my barn, I hosted a weekend movie night. I invited the neighbors, the ones who'd been silently fuming, quietly complying, or just too exhausted to care anymore. No speeches, no rants, just popcorn, beer, and a screening of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Karen drove by halfway through the movie. She didn't stop, but she definitely saw the crowd. It came in the form of a furious, typo-riddled HOA email blast. Subject line in all caps, urgent notice regarding unauthorized community gatherings. She wrote that certain rogue individuals were hosting unapproved events and spreading misinformation regarding HOA jurisdiction. It reeked of panic. She even attached a PDF titled Clarification of Extended Regulatory Zones, which, upon opening, was a grainy scan of a neighborhood flyer from 2017. Not a legal document, not a county map, just a glorified marketing pamphlet. People noticed. 2 days later, I got a knock on the door. It was Tony, grinning and holding up his phone. "You see this?" he asked. He showed me the HOA Facebook group thread. Marcy had posted one of the maps from my anonymous report with the caption, "Wait, why are we paying $1,200 per year to people who can't legally fine us?" Over 24 comments followed. Some angry, some confused. But the dam had cracked. The next morning I got a letter, but not from the HOA. This one came from the county zoning board. It was stamped and signed, "Request for jurisdictional clarification approved." The document reaffirmed what I already knew in my bones. My property fell fully outside of the Cimarron Bluffs Homeowners Association's governance. It would be updated in the public parcel records within 30 days. The letter might as well have been a sword. I scanned it, framed the original, and sent copies, certified, to both Karen and her legal liaison, Elliot Rains, ESQ. Then I waited. The next HOA newsletter came out a week later. It was quiet. No updates about visual intrusions. No notices about gatherings. No passive-aggressive blurbs about fence heights. It was 3 bland paragraphs about fall planting tips and a bake sale no one would attend. Karen's name wasn't on it. Then came the best part, the HOA board meeting. I didn't attend. I didn't need to, but Tony did, and he recorded the whole thing on his phone. It was glorious. They held it in the community rec center, which looked more like a sterile dentist's office than a town hall. Karen stood at the front, clearly trying to control the room, but questions kept flying. Is it true we can opt out? Why weren't we told some lots weren't under the HOA? Are we paying legal fees for cases we're not obligated to be part of? Karen deflected. Greg mumbled something about precedent and neighborhood standards. But they had nothing. No solid legal basis. No definitive answer. Just posture. The more they talked, the more they lost control of the room. By the end, 2 board members had resigned. A vote was called to initiate a third-party audit of HOA spending over the last 5 years. And Karen, was asked to step down as chair until further review. She didn't argue. She just collected her notes, stood stiffly, and walked out the side door, her heels clicking like a defeated metronome. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been slow-roasted. As for me, I celebrated in the only way that felt right. I finished the barn. That weekend, I invited everyone back. Tony, Marcy, Bill, and a few others who'd once whispered their frustrations behind closed doors. We grilled burgers under string lights, drank beer around a fire pit made from old cinder blocks, and laughed like we were finally allowed to exhale. I gave a short toast, not a speech, just a few words. To fences that don't box us in, I said, and rules that don't rule us. Someone raised a can. And to Karen retiring early. We laughed. We laughed hard. Later that night, I walked the edge of my land, flashlight in hand. The wind had picked up, and the stars blinked above me like they were finally watching something worth seeing. I paused at the trench, now filled and covered with stone, and thought about the box I'd found. The ledgers, the key, the past speaking up just when I needed it. Robert O. Calhoun had fought the same fight decades before, quietly, stubbornly. And now, even from the grave, the man had helped win it again. That legacy mattered. Not just to me, but to every person who'd been pushed, bullied, or buried under bureaucracy for simply wanting to live freely. This win wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. A victory for principle over pettiness, for sovereignty over suspicion. And as I stood there, breathing in the cool desert air, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Stillness. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that comes from knowing, finally, that you've stood your ground. The land has changed since those early days. The barn is complete now, painted in a deep, sun-washed red that practically glows at golden hour. I've got a small windmill turning just off the southern ridge, a modest garden growing green in the sandy soil, and a porch swing that creaks with every breeze like it's been there for decades. Life here isn't easy, but it's mine, in the purest, most hard-won sense of the word. After the fallout, the HOA quieted down considerably. Karen never did return as chair. A formal vote was held 2 months later, and a younger couple, Nick and Talia, folks who actually listened, took over as interim board members. They reached out, cautiously at first. Talia brought over fresh bread one morning and said, "We just want to keep the peace." I nodded and handed her a copy of the county jurisdiction map. We've been on good terms ever since. The audit uncovered some interesting numbers. Thousands in discretionary, consulting fees, wildly inconsistent fine allocations, and evidence of certain violations being enforced selectively. The community demanded transparency, and for the first time, people who had stayed quiet for years finally spoke up. A few folks opted out of the HOA entirely after reviewing their deeds. Most stayed, but now with eyes wide open. As for me, I became a kind of local legend. Not the loudest voice, but the one who stood his ground. At the next neighborhood gathering, an older woman I'd never met approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "I wanted to do what you did for years, but I didn't think it was possible." I told her what I wish someone had told me earlier. You don't need permission to do what's right. Looking back, I realized it was never just about fines or fences or the right to paint your house teal if you damn well please. It was about dignity, about refusing to be ruled by people who mistake control for community, about proving that even a lone person with a shovel and a dusty stack of ledgers can shift the balance, if they're persistent enough. The most surprising part? The ranch became more than a place to live. It became a place where people gathered, where folks remembered how to talk, how to listen, how to question the rules instead of blindly obeying them. I've hosted movie nights, bonfires, even a small fall market where neighbors brought jam jars and handmade soaps and desert-grown squash. None of it was approved. All of it was real. There's something sacred about that. The land didn't just give me peace. It gave me purpose. I bought it thinking I was escaping something. The city, the grind, the noise. But what I really found was something to protect. Something worth digging in for, both literally and figuratively. My fight with the HOA wasn't the obstacle. It was the crucible. And I'm better for it. Now, when I sit on my porch and hear the wind roll across the plain, I don't brace for another letter. I lean back, breathe deep, and smile. Because I know what it took to earn this quiet. And I'll be damned if anyone takes it away again. Fountain pen, outro, 2 to 3 sentences / 500 words. So yeah, I risked $750,000 and my entire life savings on a forgotten patch of dirt. I got more than splinters and sunburn for it. I got tested, pushed, cornered, and I pushed back. And that's how a so-called visual nuisance became a rallying point. That's how a shade of independence painted brighter than any HOA-approved beige ever could.